Victoria Collins ripped the bill of sale off her desk and threw it across the room. "Get that junk off my property. 10 days, not 11. The paper fluttered to the floor, $220 sign done. She didn't even watch the mechanic walk out. But that single piece of paper, that throwaway transaction she didn't bother to read twice, was about to bring a billionaire to her door, an investigation to her boardroom, and the most humiliating moment of her entire career. What happened next will shock you. Drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. And if you're new here, hit subscribe. You won't want to miss where this goes. The auction started at 9 in the morning, and by 9:15, everyone in the hall already knew exactly what kind of day it was going to be. Folding chairs scraped against concrete floors. Coffee cups sweated in people's hands. A few men in business suits stood near the back with their arms crossed, checking their phones every 30 seconds, like they had somewhere better to be, which they probably did. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed with that particular tone that makes the back of your teeth ache if you're in a room long enough. Gerald Fitch, the auctioneer, had been doing this for 22 years. He could read a room faster than most people could read a menu. And the room he was reading right now was telling him one clear thing. Nobody here wanted to be the last person standing when the ugly stuff came up. He moved through the early lots quickly. A twin-engine Cessna in decent shape went for $340,000 to a corporate buyer from Atlanta who barely blinked. A decommissioned turboprop went to a leasing company for $198,000. A row of avionics equipment got picked apart, piece by piece, by a group of gray-haired technicians who argued over every unit like it was a family heirloom. And then Gerald reached Lot 47. He cleared his throat. "All right, ladies and gentlemen, Lot 47, non-operational helicopter, listed for scrap value. Condition as is, no warranty, no documentation guarantee, no engine present. Starting bid." Someone in the third row laughed. Not rudely, just the kind of involuntary laugh a person makes when a situation is too absurd to absorb quietly. Gerald paused. He'd heard that laugh before. He looked out at the crowd and saw what he expected to see. Arms still crossed, eyes drifting back to phones. Two men near the side wall were already talking to each other, checked out, waiting for the next real item to come up. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. And then a hand went up in the second row. Caleb Morgan didn't raise his hand, the way people raise their hands when they're confident. He didn't shoot it up fast or hold it high to make sure he was seen. He raised it slowly, deliberately, the way a man raises his hand when he's already made his decision and doesn't care what the room thinks about it. I was 39 years old and he looked every bit of it, not in a worn-out way, but in the way of a man who had spent nearly 2 decades using his hands for work that mattered. His knuckles were calloused. There was a faint shadow of grease under his thumbnail that soap hadn't completely reached. His work jacket was faded olive green, the kind of jacket that had been washed so many times, the color had softened to something between army and gray. I didn't look like a buyer. He looked like someone who'd come to fix something. Gerald saw the hand. "We have a bid. Sir, your amount, $222, Caleb said. The laugh came again, louder this time, not from one person, from several. Gerald kept his face professionally neutral, though his eyebrows did rise approximately a quarter inch. $222. Do we have any other? Silence. He waited 4 seconds. Standard practice. Lot 47 sold. $222. The gavel came down, and in the back of the room, behind a group of her own employees, Victoria Collins watched the whole thing with an expression that barely qualified as interest. She was 44 years old, and she had built her reputation on exactly the kind of ruthlessness that made people respect her and resent her in equal measure. The fourth-generation CEO of Avery Collins Aviation, one of the oldest private aviation companies in the United States, she had taken over the company at 38 after her father's stroke left him unable to run it, and she had spent the last 6 years systematically cutting every program, every department, every asset that wasn't generating a clear return on investment. She wore a charcoal blazer over a silk blouse. Her watch cost more than Caleb Morgan's truck. Her assistant, a young woman named Dana, stood 2 steps behind her at all times with a tablet and an expression of permanent preparedness. Victoria had come to the auction for one reason: to move assets that were costing her money to store. The helicopter Lot 47 had been sitting in a secondary hangar for 11 years. It occupied floor space. It attracted dust. It appeared in company inventory as a liability, not an asset. When she'd asked her team about it 6 months ago, the only person who'd had anything useful to say was Richard Hale, the company's financial director, who'd told her crisply, "Scrap it or auction it, it's just taking up room." She'd chosen the auction. Now it was gone. For $222. She leaned toward Dana. "Make sure he has the removal paperwork. 10 days. After that, we charge storage." "Yes, Ms. Collins." Victoria's eyes drifted back toward the front of the room, where Caleb was already moving through the crowd toward the registration table. She watched him for exactly 3 seconds. Then she looked back at her phone. What she didn't see was the way Caleb moved once the auctioneer's gavel came down. He didn't rush. He didn't look excited. He walked to the registration table with the kind of controlled composure that only comes from a man who's been managing his reactions in public for a very long time, a man who has learned that showing too much costs you things you didn't mean to spend. He signed the paperwork. He counted out his cash, mostly 20s and a pair of 10s, and handed it across the table without hesitation. Then he walked back through the hall toward the secondary hangar where Lot 47 was being held. He pushed open the side door, and for a moment, standing in that hangar, Caleb Morgan was completely alone with the helicopter. It looked like a disaster. There was no other honest way to describe it. The paint was gone in large patches peeled away by what looked like heat damage. The cockpit glass was cracked across the center, like someone had put a fist through it. Where the engine should have been was a hollow cavity, bolts removed, systems extracted, leaving behind a strange negative space that made the machine look like something had been ripped out of its chest. The rotor blades were still present, but 2 of the 4 were bent at odd angles. The tail boom had a dent the size of a fist. Rust had found its way into the joints. A lesser man or a smarter man, depending on who you asked, would have seen a pile of metal with a $290 price tag and considered it a fair exchange. Caleb walked forward and crouched beside the landing skids. He ran his fingers along the undercarriage frame. He stopped. He ran them back slower this time. He looked at the metal, really looked at it, the kind of looking that takes years to learn and can't be taught in a classroom. The alloy was unusual. The composition of the frame was unlike standard production models from any manufacturer he could immediately place. The gauge distribution was wrong. Not wrong as in incorrect, but wrong as in non-standard, which in aviation engineering meant one of 2 things. Either the machine had been modified or the machine had never been standard to begin with. He stood and moved to the tail section. He examined the rotor hub. He stood there for a long time, not moving, not speaking, just thinking. Then he pulled out his phone and opened the camera. He began photographing specific sections of the airframe methodically, not randomly. He wasn't taking vacation photos, he was building documentation. When he reached the rear left panel, a section partially buckled inward from what must have been a hard impact. At some point he pushed against it carefully with his palm. The metal flexed just slightly, and through the gap, where the panel had separated from the frame, barely visible, barely legible, he saw something scratched directly into the interior structure. Numbers and letters, not a sticker, not a label, stamped into the metal itself, a serial number. He took a photo. Then he stood up, slid his phone back into his pocket, and stayed very still for almost a full minute. Outside, the auction continued. People bought and sold machinery. Dollars were exchanged. Lots moved through the hall at the auctioneer's practiced rhythm. Inside the hangar, Caleb Morgan looked at a burned-out helicopter that everyone else had walked past for 11 years. And he said very quietly to no one, "There you are." Han had his daughter that afternoon. Lily was 10 years old, and she had her mother's eyes dark brown, the kind that always seemed to be processing something slightly faster than the conversation happening in front of them. She was small for her age, but she wasn't quiet. She had opinions about everything, and had developed over the previous 2 years an unsettling ability to ask questions that went straight to the center of whatever issue her father was carefully trying to avoid discussing. She was sitting at the kitchen table doing homework when he came in, and she looked up at him the way she always did, a rapid visual assessment, the way kids do when they've spent enough time reading a parent's moods to do it instinctively. "You bought it," she said. It wasn't a question. "I bought it," he confirmed. "How much?" $222. She looked back at her homework, then back at him. "Is that all our grocery money?" "No," he said. "Close, but no." "Dad." "Lily." "People were laughing at the auction," she said. "Marcus's dad was there. He texted Marcus, and Marcus told me at school." Caleb set his keys on the counter and moved to the refrigerator. And what did Marcus say? He said his dad said you bought a pile of trash. Caleb opened the refrigerator, looked at its contents without really seeing them, and closed it again. Marcus's dad would know trash when he sees it. He drives a boat on weekends. Lily's mouth twitched. She fought the smile and lost. That's not a good answer. It's the best one I have right now. What if they're right? She said it carefully, the way she'd clearly been rehearsing it on the bus ride home. What if it really is just junk? He turned around and leaned back against the counter looking at his daughter. She was watching him with that expression she got, the one that looked like her mother, the one that always made his chest tighten slightly without warning. Then I lose $222, he said. We eat pasta for a week. It hurts and then it stops hurting. And if you're right. I was quiet for a moment, not performing the silence, just genuinely thinking about how to answer in a way that was true and not just reassuring. If I'm right, he said, then something that matters is still here. That's worth more than pasta. Lily looked at him for a long moment. You're going to be in the garage all weekend again, she said. Probably. She turned back to her homework. I'm making sandwiches for lunch. I'm not doing hot dogs. Fair, he said. He'd learned what he knew about aircraft from a man named Earl Pemberton, who had died 6 years ago at the age of 78, and whose memorial had been attended by almost nobody because Earl hadn't been famous, hadn't been wealthy, and hadn't spent his life pursuing the kinds of accomplishments that get eulogized in large rooms. What Earl had been was a mechanic for 51 years. He had worked on helicopters during the Vietnam era. He had worked on experimental aircraft through the 1970s and 80s. He had spent the last 20 years of his working life in a small facility outside of Knoxville, Tennessee, where private contractors sometimes brought unusual machines they didn't want to explain in writing. Caleb had met him when he was 19 during a summer job that was supposed to last 8 weeks and lasted 3 years. Earl had not been a warm man in the conventional sense. He didn't give compliments freely. He didn't ask about your personal life. He taught by doing, by pointing, by sometimes grabbing your hand and physically moving it to the place he needed you to understand. But he had given Caleb the single most important piece of instruction he'd ever received in his professional life, and he'd given it on a Tuesday afternoon in a hangar in Tennessee, standing next to a helicopter that had been brought in with no explanation and sent away 2 weeks later with no explanation. A machine tells its story, Earl had said, not looking up from the rotor assembly he was inspecting. Every choice the engineer made is sitting right here waiting. The material, the tolerances, the way they solved a problem nobody told you they were solving. You want to know what something is? Stop looking at what it looks like. Start listening to how it was thought about. Caleb had been 21 at the time. He'd nodded like he understood. It took him another 10 years to fully understand. But by the time he was standing in his own garage, the burned-out helicopter on a set of borrowed dollies, the door closed, the fluorescent work light humming overhead, he understood completely. He got to work. The first night, he didn't try to fix anything. He just looked. He went over every surface of the aircraft with a high-beam inspection light, a magnifying glass, and the systematic patience of a man who had learned to move slowly when the situation demanded it. He photographed. He measured. He labeled sections of the airframe with strips of blue painter's tape and wrote notes on each one with a black marker. The rotor hub design was wrong, not broken wrong. The blade pitch control mechanism used a configuration he'd never seen in a production helicopter, but he'd seen something adjacent to it once in a technical journal article he'd read years earlier about experimental designs from the late 1960s. He wrote that down. The airframe material. When he carefully tested a small interior section with the tools he had available, returned measurements that didn't match any standard production aluminum alloy. The weight distribution was unusual. The frame cross-sections were over-engineered in specific places where a production model would have cut weight to reduce costs, which meant this aircraft had been built to specifications that prioritized performance over manufacturing efficiency. Which meant it wasn't built for the market. It was built for a test. He wrote that down too. The third discovery was the hydraulic routing. The lines, even in their current damaged state, traced paths through the airframe that were unlike any routing schematic he'd seen. They weren't inefficient. They were the opposite. They were the kind of elegant, non-obvious solution that shows up when an engineer with exceptional skill is solving a problem they've been thinking about for a very long time. By midnight, Caleb had filled 4 pages of a yellow legal pad. He sat on a shop stool, set the pad on his knee, and looked at the aircraft. The serial number was still in his camera. He pulled out his phone and looked at the photo he'd taken. He zoomed in. He read the alphanumeric sequence 3 times. Then he opened his laptop and started searching. Aviation records, the real ones, the deep ones, the ones that don't surface on a consumer search, require patience and knowledge of where to look. Caleb had both. Over the years, through connections made at repair shops and regional aviation events, and one memorable 3-day conference in Dayton, Ohio, where he'd met 2 former engineers who talked too much. After a few drinks, he had assembled a working knowledge of where obscure aircraft documentation lived. He knew about the FAA historical archives. He knew about several university collections that held donated records from defunct aviation programs. He knew about a digitization project that had quietly uploaded thousands of documents from programs that had been classified and then declassified and then largely forgotten. He started with the serial number. The format was unusual. Not wrong, but structured in a way that didn't match any standard FAA assignment pattern he could identify. The prefix characters suggested a research designation rather than a civilian production registration. He cross-referenced it against 3 databases. Nothing came back directly. But in the 3rd database, a partially indexed collection of records from a 1970s government-adjacent research program, he found a formatting match, not the number itself, but the structure. The prefix pattern was consistent with experimental aircraft registered under a specific program that had operated between 1968 and 1974. The program was called the Advanced Rotary Research Initiative. He searched the ARI. Most of what came up was routine, standard experimental aircraft documentation, the kind of bureaucratic record-keeping that fills government archives, forms, approvals, budget summaries, progress reports written in the flat, affectless language of people who are being careful about what they put in writing. But then buried in a digitized document index, he found a reference. A single line in a project summary from 1972. Phoenix X1 prototype development complete. Transfer to field testing phase. Lead engineer S. Whitaker. Flight test designation C. Whitmore pilot. Below it, in a different typeface, clearly added later, program terminated. Prototype destroyed in facility fire, March 1974. Records sealed. Caleb read the line about the destroyed prototype. He looked at the helicopter in his garage. He read the line again. He sat in his shop stool in his garage in the middle of the night with a legal pad full of notes and a laptop screen casting pale blue light across his face, and he let the weight of what he was looking at settle into him completely. Then he leaned forward, turned back to the search, and typed Phoenix X1, Dr. Samuel Whitaker, Claire Whitmore. What came back took his breath away. Not all at once, in pieces. Samuel Whitaker had been, by every account he could find, one of the most gifted aerospace engineers of his generation. He'd published 5 papers between 1965 and 1971 that other engineers described in subsequent technical literature as foundational visionary, and in one memorable phrase from a 1989 retrospective, so far ahead of the conventional thinking of the period that they were largely dismissed until the field caught up with them. Whitaker had disappeared from public aviation history in 1974. No publications after that year, no conference appearances, no patents filed, nothing. The timeline matched the program termination. Claire Whitmore was harder to find. The name didn't surface prominently in any aviation history Caleb could locate initially. She appeared in the margins, a photograph caption here, a roster mention there. She had been a licensed test pilot in the early 1970s, one of a small number of women in that role at the time. She had worked with at least 2 experimental programs. And then, in a scanned copy of a regional aviation newsletter from 1973, he found a small article. It was barely 4 paragraphs. It described a successful test flight of an experimental rotary aircraft that had demonstrated performance characteristics significantly exceeding standard production benchmarks. The pilot credited was C. Whitmore. The program was not named. The next issue of the newsletter made no reference to the flight at all. Caleb sat back. He looked at the ceiling of his garage. Then he looked at the helicopter. The official record said the Phoenix X1 had been destroyed in a fire in March of 1974. The helicopter in his garage was real. He had touched it. He had measured it. He had run his hands along the unusual alloy of its frame and felt the engineering decisions encoded in its structure. One of those two things was a lie. And whatever the lie was protecting, whatever the fire had been meant to erase it, was sitting in his garage in the form of a burned-out aircraft that a CEO had just sold him for $222. He picked up his legal pad, he turned to a fresh page, and he wrote at the top in capital letters, "Who knew?" The answer to that question, as it turned out, was closer than he expected. 3 days after the auction, while Caleb was working on a legitimate paying job during business hours, a piston engine overhaul on a small private aircraft, his phone rang. He didn't recognize the number. Local area code. "Morgan Aircraft Repair," he said, cradling the phone against his shoulder while his hands stayed on the work. "Mr. Morgan." The voice was male-clipped, the kind of voice trained by years of professional environments to give away nothing. "My name is Hale, Richard Hale. I'm the financial director at Avery Collins Aviation." Caleb set down his tool and picked up the phone properly. "Mr. Hale, I'm calling regarding Lot 47 from last Thursday's auction, the helicopter you purchased." "What about it?" A pause. Just half a beat, the kind of pause a careful man uses to decide exactly how to frame the next sentence. "We may have made an administrative error in the auction listing. It's possible there are some documentation issues that need to be resolved before your title is considered clean." Caleb leaned against his workbench. "The sale was final. I have signed paperwork." "Of course, I'm not suggesting otherwise. I'm suggesting that as a matter of mutual benefit, it might be worth a conversation about whether the aircraft should remain in private hands while we resolve some internal inventory discrepancies." Inventory discrepancies. Clerical issues. Nothing significant, but potentially the kind of thing that could complicate your ownership if they're not addressed. The directness wasn't lost on Caleb. Neither was the careful avoidance of anything specific. This was a man who knew exactly what he was saying without saying anything he could be held to. "I appreciate the call," Caleb said. "I'm not interested in selling. The paperwork is clean. If Avery Collins has an internal documentation issue, I'd recommend your legal department address it internally." Another pause. Longer this time. "Mr. Morgan, out of courtesy, and I'm being direct with you here man to man, I'd suggest you not invest too much further in that aircraft. These kinds of projects have a way of becoming complicated for people who aren't prepared for the complications." Caleb was quiet for a moment. "Mr. Hale," he said finally, "I appreciate the advice. I'll keep it in mind." He ended the call. He stood in his shop for a long moment, looking at the open engine bay of the aircraft in front of him. Then he walked to his desk, opened a drawer, and pulled out a fresh legal pad. At the top, he wrote Richard Hale's name. Below it, he wrote, "Knew about the helicopter. Wanted it back before I found something." Why, he underlined the last word. That night, he called his old friend Dennis Rayburn, who had spent 30 years as an aviation insurance investigator and had a memory for aviation history that bordered on the pathological. "Dennis, you ever hear of the Phoenix X-1? The line went quiet for almost 5 full seconds. "Where did you hear that name?" "Research," Caleb said. "What do you know?" Dennis breathed out slowly. "Caleb, that program has been off the books for 50 years. Why are you asking about it?" "Because I bought a helicopter last week that I think might be it." The silence this time lasted longer. "That's not possible," Dennis said. "The prototype was destroyed in '74. There was a fire. The program was closed. The documentation was sealed." "I know what the official record says." "Caleb, the serial number matches the ARI program structure. The airframe alloy is non-standard. The rotor configuration is consistent with the design principles Whitaker published in his 1971 paper. And I got a phone call today from the financial director of the company that sold it to me, suggesting very politely that I shouldn't look too closely at what I bought." Another long pause. "How much did you pay for it?" Dennis asked. $222. He heard Dennis exhale. "Lord Almighty." "Yeah," Caleb said. "You need to be careful," Dennis said. "I mean that. If that aircraft is what you think it is, there are people who have spent a long time making sure nobody asked about it. And now you've bought the thing at a public auction for pocket change because everyone thought you were buying junk." "I know. You're not going to drop this, are you?" It wasn't really a question. "No," Caleb said. "I'm not." Dennis was quiet for a moment. Then, "There was a woman, Claire Whitmore. She flew the prototype before the program was shut down. After the fire, she tried to talk about what she'd done, about the test flight, about the results." "What happened?" "Nothing happened," Dennis said. "That was the problem. Nobody listened. The program was gone. The records were sealed. She didn't have documentation, and the people who could have backed her up had moved on. She spent a few years trying to get anyone in aviation to pay attention to what she knew, and eventually she just stopped. Is she still alive? She passed away about 12 years ago. She had a son. I don't know what happened to him. Caleb wrote that down. Thanks, Dennis. Be careful, Dennis said again. I mean it. I know. Caleb looked at the yellow legal pad in front of him, at the name at the top, at the question he'd underlined. I will. He hung up and sat in the quiet of his kitchen. The house was asleep. Lily had gone to bed 2 hours ago, after extracting a promise that he would not spend the entire night in the garage. He had technically kept that promise. He was in the kitchen instead. He thought about Claire Whitmore, a woman who had flown a revolutionary aircraft and then spent years trying to convince people it was real, and then stopped trying, and then died without being believed. I thought about Samuel Whitaker, whose papers had been described as visionary, who had disappeared from aviation history in 1974, the same year the program officially ended. He thought about the serial number stamped into the interior frame of the helicopter in his garage, deliberately placed, not a sticker, not a label, stamped directly into the metal in a location that would survive almost any surface damage. Someone had wanted that number to be findable. Someone had wanted the helicopter to be identifiable to the right person if the right person ever looked. He sat at his kitchen table for a long time. Then he went back to the garage. He had a lot more listening to do. 3 days after the phone call from Richard Hale, Caleb received a certified letter. It came on a Tuesday morning, delivered while Lily was at school, and Caleb was underneath a single-engine Piper doing an oil system inspection for a regular customer. He heard the mail truck. He heard the knock on the side door of his shop. He wiped his hands on a shop rag, signed for the envelope, and stood in the doorway reading it. The letter was from a law firm, Dawson Price and Associates, with an address in downtown Nashville. It was 3 paragraphs long and written in the careful, expensive language that lawyers use when they want to sound helpful while delivering a threat. The first paragraph said that Avery Collins Aviation had identified a potential discrepancy in the auction documentation for Lot 47, specifically that the aircraft may have been listed under an incorrect internal asset classification, which could affect the legal validity of the transfer. The second paragraph said that Avery Collins was willing to resolve this matter amicably and out of court by repurchasing the aircraft at a price reflecting its fair scrap market value, estimated at between $300 and $500. The third paragraph said that if Caleb declined, Avery Collins reserved the right to pursue formal legal remedies to address the documentation discrepancy, which could result in the transfer being voided pending review. Caleb read it twice. Then he folded it along its original crease, slid it back into the envelope, and set it on his workbench next to his coffee. He went back under the Piper and finished the inspection. When he was done, he washed his hands, sat at his desk, and called a woman named Patricia Oakes, who had been a contract attorney in the aviation space for 27 years and who owed Caleb a favor from 2019 when he'd correctly identified a fatal maintenance error on an aircraft before it flew, potentially saving the lives of 3 people. "Pat," he said when she answered, "I need 20 minutes. "You've got 15. What happened?" He told her. The auction, the letter, the phone call from Hale 3 days earlier. He read her the relevant sections of the certified letter. When he finished, there was a brief pause. "The sale was final and publicly conducted," Patricia said. "The auctioneer was licensed. You paid, you signed, they signed. Documentation discrepancy is a reach and a weak one. If there was a genuine internal classification error, that's their problem to absorb, not a legal basis to unwind a completed auction." That's what I thought. "Their play is intimidation," she said. "They're hoping you don't know that, or that the cost of finding out scares you more than it scares them. It doesn't. I know it doesn't, which is why I'm telling you to be careful about what that means." Her voice shifted slightly, not harder, but more direct. "Caleb, what's in that helicopter?" He paused. "I'm not sure yet," he said, "but enough that a financial director at a major aviation company made a personal phone call to a nobody mechanic 3 days after a 222-hour auction sale. That's not nothing." "No," he said, "it's not." "Okay, send me the letter. Don't respond to it. Don't respond to Hale. If they contact you again, forward everything to me first." "Understood." "And Caleb, document everything. Every call, every letter, every time someone from that company looks at you sideways. Date, time, content. Write it down the same day. He looked at the yellow legal pad stacked on the corner of his desk. Already started, he said. What Richard Hale did not know, what nobody at Avery Collins Aviation had thought to consider, because nobody there had thought about Caleb Morgan as anything more than an inconvenience to be managed, was that Caleb had already found the second set of documents. He'd found them on the fourth night. He'd been working on the interior of the aircraft's nose section, carefully removing damaged panels to assess the underlying structure when he noticed something wrong with the panel backing. Not wrong as in broken, wrong as in deliberate. The rear face of one of the interior access panels had a secondary layer. It was thin, barely perceptible to the eye, but when he ran his hand across it, the surface was slightly uneven. Not from damage, from concealment. He got a flathead screwdriver and worked carefully along the edge. The secondary layer came away in one piece. It had been sealed with an adhesive that had dried and cracked over decades, and it came free with a sound like old tape releasing from a wall. Behind it was a slim packet of documents, folded once wrapped in a material that had originally been waterproof but had partially degraded over the years. Inside the degraded wrapping, however, the documents themselves had survived. There were 11 pages. The first page was a cover sheet. Handwritten at the top in ink that had faded to a pale brown were the words, "For the record, in case the record is ever needed, S.W. Samuel Whitaker." Caleb sat on the concrete floor of his garage for a long time with those 11 pages in his hands. The documents were a combination of technical specifications and personal notes. The technical sections described the Phoenix X-1's core engineering innovations in a level of detail that no published record contained. The rotor pitch control system, the vibration dampening design, the performance projections based on the test flight data. The personal notes were something different. They were written in a careful, controlled hand that only cracked slightly in a few places. They described what had happened to the program, not in vague terms in specific ones, dates, names, decisions. The program had not been terminated because of the fire. The fire had been used to explain a termination that had already been decided for other reasons. There were people named in the document with titles and organizational affiliations who had determined that the Phoenix X-1's performance capabilities created competitive problems, not for national security, for business, for contracts already in place with manufacturers who built the conventional systems that the Phoenix X-1 made look outdated. The prototype had not been destroyed. It had been transferred. Moved through a chain of transactions that obscured its origin and identity, eventually disappearing into an inventory of miscellaneous assets at a company that would absorb and forget it without ever understanding what it had. Avery Collins Aviation. Samuel Whitaker had known where it went. He had concealed these documents inside the aircraft before the transfer, and he had stamped the serial number into the interior frame, and he had trusted that someday, not necessarily soon, but someday, someone with the right knowledge and the right patience would find it. The last page of the document was a single paragraph. Claire flew this aircraft on the morning of November 14, 1973. She flew it beautifully. The results confirmed everything we had worked toward for 6 years. What happened after that day is not her failure and not mine. The aircraft is real. The flight was real. If you are reading this, then someone found what I tried to preserve. I hope they understand what it means. Caleb read that paragraph 3 times. Then he set the documents carefully on his workbench, walked to the back of his shop, and stood with his hands against the wall for a moment, not moving. He thought about Samuel Whitaker writing those words in 1974, hiding them inside an aircraft he was about to lose, trusting in something he couldn't be sure would ever come. He thought about 50 years. Then he went back to the workbench and began photographing every page. The following Monday, Victoria Collins had a meeting she hadn't scheduled. She arrived at her office at 7:45 in the morning, her standard time, and found Richard Hale already waiting outside her door. He was a tall man in his early 60s, silver-haired with the kind of permanent composure that either came from discipline or from having done enough questionable things over a long career that you simply run out of the capacity to be visibly rattled. This morning, however, his composure had developed a small crack. "Richard," she said, unlocking her office door, "you're early. I need a few minutes." She waved him in. She set her bag down, moved to her desk, and looked at him. "What is it?" "The mechanic," he said. Morgan, he hasn't responded to the letter. Give it time. It's been 9 days. She looked at him more carefully. Richard, why does this matter to you personally? The aircraft is gone. We took a negligible loss on a scrap asset. Legal sent a letter. If he ignores it, we move on. Hale shifted his weight slightly. It was a tiny movement, barely perceptible, but Victoria had spent 6 years watching people across conference tables and she noticed it. There may be some documentation connected to that aircraft, he said, that could create complications for the company if it were to surface in an uncontrolled way. She sat back in her chair. She looked at him steadily. What kind of documentation? Historical, related to how the aircraft came into our inventory. He paused. There were some acquisition decisions made prior to my tenure or early in my tenure that may not have been properly recorded. I want to make sure that if this mechanic has found anything, it's handled appropriately before it goes somewhere we can't manage it. Victoria was quiet for a moment. Richard, she said, and her voice had changed in a way that made his jaw tighten slightly. Are you telling me there's something about that helicopter that you've known about and you didn't tell me? I'm telling you there are some historical complexities. Historical complexities. She said the word slowly, the way you repeat something when you need to hear it again to believe it. In an aircraft, you told me to auction off for scrap. The asset had no current operational value. That is not what I asked you. She leaned forward. Did you know what was in that aircraft? Hale met her eyes. I knew there were some old records potentially associated with it that could be sensitive. How long have you known? The pause was a second too long. Richard. Since before you took over, he said. The room went quiet. Victoria Collins sat behind her desk and looked at her financial director of 6 years, a man she had inherited from her father's administration, a man she had trusted with every significant financial decision the company had made under her leadership, and she felt something she rarely allowed herself to feel in professional settings. She felt the ground shift. Get out of my office, she said. Not loudly. The quieter version was always worse. Victoria. Not another word. Get out. Don't talk to anyone in legal. Don't contact Morgan. Don't send anything else under our letterhead without my explicit approval. You sit in your office and you wait for me to tell you what happens next. Hale left. Victoria stayed very still at her desk for almost 3 minutes after her door closed. Then she picked up her phone and called her personal attorney. Caleb didn't know about that conversation. He wouldn't learn about it for several more weeks. What he knew in the days following the delivery of the certified letter was that the pressure had been applied and he had not moved, and that sometimes when pressure is applied and the target doesn't move, the people applying it make different decisions. Some of those decisions escalate. He got his first indication of escalation on a Thursday afternoon when a man he didn't recognize came into his shop while he was at the front desk catching up on invoices. The man was in his mid-40s, unremarkable in appearance, wearing a collared shirt and carrying what looked like a clipboard. He said he was from the State Aviation Authority conducting a routine compliance review of licensed repair facilities. Caleb looked at him. Badge, he said. The man produced one. It looked right. Caleb photographed it with his phone before handing it back, which made the man's expression do something complicated. The inspection lasted 40 minutes. The man went through every corner of the shop, the work logs, the parts inventory, the maintenance records, the tool calibration certificates. He asked careful, technically informed questions. He found nothing wrong, because there was nothing wrong. Caleb ran a clean shop. He always had. At the end, the man stood at the door and said, "Everything appears to be in order." "Good," Caleb said. "The helicopter in your personal storage area." He gestured toward the back of the property. "That's not a licensed repair project. It's personal property." "Correct. Just making sure the distinction is clear for our records." "It's clear," Caleb said. "Is there anything else?" The man looked at him for a moment. Then, "No. Thank you for your time, Mr. Morgan." He left. Caleb stood in his shop doorway and watched the man's car leave the parking lot. He noted the make, model, and license plate. He wrote them down in the legal pad. He also noted the time and wrote the word "sent" next to the entry because someone had sent this man and everyone in the situation already knew who. He called Patricia that evening. "Compliance inspection," she said. "Out of nowhere. 40 minutes. They found nothing." "Of course they found nothing." He could hear the contained anger in her voice. This is pressure. This is what pressure looks like when lawyers get involved and the letter doesn't work. They're trying to make you uncomfortable, trying to make you feel like the ground could move under your business at any time. It's not going to work. I know it's not. But Caleb, I need you to understand what this means. They wouldn't be doing this if there wasn't something significant in that aircraft. People don't send compliance inspectors after a $220 auction sale unless the $220 scares them considerably more than it should. I know what's in it, he said. And then carefully he told her about the documents. The 11 pages, Samuel Whitaker's final record. When he finished, Patricia was silent for a long moment. You need to secure those physically, she said. Not just photographs, the originals. Store them somewhere that isn't your home and isn't your shop. Already done, he said. He'd put them in a safety deposit box at his bank 2 days after finding them, along with copies of all his photographs, his legal pads, and the certified letter from Dawson Price and Associates. Good. Another pause. Caleb, these documents, if they say what you're describing, this isn't just an old aviation story. This is evidence of a deliberate suppression of a significant engineering development. Depending on who is involved and what contracts were affected, this could be relevant to people who are very much still active. I know. Do you know who Claire Whitmore's family is? Her son? I'm working on that. Work faster, she said. It was Lily who found the connection. Not through any legal search or professional network or carefully constructed chain of research. She found it the way 10-year-olds often find things in the 21st century by accident while doing something entirely different with the particular form of attention that doesn't know yet that it's supposed to filter certain things out. She had been watching a video online about aviation museums, a school project on American transportation history, when she saw a name that made her stop the video and go find her father. He was in the garage carefully cleaning corrosion from the helicopter's rotor hub attachment points when she appeared in the doorway. Dad. Is Claire Whitmore connected to Sterling Aerospace? He set down the wire brush he was using. He turned around. Where did you hear that? I was watching a video for my school project about aviation museums. There's a new one that's being built, the Sterling Aerospace Museum, and the person building it is named Adrian Sterling, and the video said it was built in honor of his mother, who was a pioneer in experimental aviation. She was holding her tablet, which was still playing the video frozen on a frame, showing a man in his late 50s standing in front of a partially constructed building. His mother's maiden name was Claire Whitmore Sterling. Caleb looked at the tablet, at the man in the video, at the building behind him. He reached out and took the tablet from his daughter's hands. He pressed play. The video was a local news segment about 4 minutes long covering the announcement of a new aerospace museum being funded by billionaire industrialist Adrian Sterling, founder and majority owner of Sterling Aerospace Systems, one of the largest private aerospace companies in the country, with contracts spanning defense, commercial aviation, and emerging technology sectors. Adrian Sterling was 61 years old. He was a large man, gray at the temples, with the kind of contained physical presence that suggested a person who had once been restless and had spent decades learning to channel it. He spoke carefully in the video, without the performance of someone who enjoyed cameras, but with the precision of someone who had learned that carelessness cost you things you cared about. He said that the museum would be a celebration of aviation innovation, with a particular focus on the contributions of engineers and pilots who had worked outside the mainstream. He said his mother had been one of those people. He said she had done something remarkable that the world had not recognized, and that this museum was in part his way of correcting that. When the interviewer asked what specifically his mother had done, Adrian Sterling paused. It was a brief pause, maybe 2 seconds. But Caleb recognized that pause. It was the pause of a man who knows something significant and has been sitting with it for a very long time and is choosing carefully how much of it to release. She flew an aircraft, Adrian Sterling said. That's what she did. She flew it perfectly, and then a lot of people spent a long time making sure nobody knew about it. The video ended. Lily was looking at her father with wide eyes. Dad, she said quietly, is that connected to your helicopter? Caleb set the tablet down on his workbench. He looked at the helicopter, at the rotor hub he'd been cleaning, at the legal pads stacked against the wall, at the safety deposit box key hanging on a hook by the door. His mother, he said, flew this aircraft. Lily absorbed that. What are you going to do? I thought about Samuel Whitaker writing 11 pages in 1974 and hiding them in the wall of an aircraft and hoping. He thought about Claire Whitmore spending years trying to tell her story and being ignored until she stopped trying. He thought about the compliance inspector, about the certified letter, about Richard Hale's careful, threatening voice on the phone. "I'm going to find Adrian Sterling," he said. Finding Adrian Sterling was not the difficult part. Adrian Sterling was a public figure with a public presence, a company, a foundation, a museum project, a documented history. His contact information at the corporate level was easily available. The difficult part was crafting the message. Caleb was not a man who wrote carefully by habit. He thought carefully and spoke carefully, but writing felt to him like a tool he'd never fully developed the touch for, like working with a wrench in your non-dominant hand. You could do it. It just cost you more. He sat at the kitchen table after Lily went to bed, and he wrote a message to Adrian Sterling's foundation. He wrote 5 drafts. The first 4 were too long, too detailed, too much like a man trying to prove something before anyone had asked him to. The 5th draft was 4 sentences. "My name is Caleb Morgan. I am an aircraft mechanic in Tennessee. 3 weeks ago I purchased at auction a helicopter that I believe to be the Phoenix X1 prototype. I have found documents inside the aircraft that I think your family has been looking for." He sent it at 11:17 at night. He didn't expect a quick response. He expected the message to reach a junior assistant somewhere, to be screened with polite professional skepticism, to potentially never reach Adrian Sterling himself. How was wrong? He got a response at 6:42 the following morning. It came from a private email address, not the foundation. It was 3 lines long. "Mr. Morgan, I have been looking for this aircraft for 20 years. Please call me directly. A. Sterling." A phone number followed. Caleb looked at the message for a long time before he picked up his phone. The phone call lasted 1 hour and 40 minutes. In his life, Caleb had had maybe a handful of conversations that he knew while they were happening were the kind that people look back on as turning points, not because of drama, but because of weight. The weight of what was being said and what it meant for the time before the conversation and the time after it. This was one of those conversations. Adrian Sterling spoke in a measured, controlled way, but underneath the control was something that had clearly been waiting a very long time to find a place to go. He had spent 20 years building an empire in aerospace, in part, he said, because the industry had taken something from his mother, and he had determined early that the only effective response to that kind of theft was to build something powerful enough that the people responsible could no longer afford to ignore you. He had searched for the Phoenix X1 for 2 decades. He had hired professionals to trace its transfer history. He had reached dead ends because the trail had been deliberately obscured. He had commissioned historical research into Samuel Whitaker. He had found references to the program, but never the proof. The prototype was the proof, he said. Without the physical aircraft, everything else is hearsay. People can dismiss a paper record. They cannot dismiss the machine itself. "I have the machine," Caleb said. "I know you do." A pause. "How did you find it?" Caleb told him. "The auction, the serial number, the alloy, the rotor configuration, the hidden documents." He was thorough and precise, and Adrian Sterling listened without interrupting, which was its own form of respect. When Caleb finished, Adrian was quiet for a moment. "My mother flew that aircraft on a November morning in 1973, he said. "I was 8 years old. She came home that evening and she was—" He paused. "She was lit up. That's the only way I can describe it. She was a reserved woman. She didn't show emotion easily. But that evening she was lit up from the inside like something had opened up in her. She told me she had flown something that changed everything. That's what she said. Something that changes everything." Caleb didn't speak. And then the program ended, and the aircraft disappeared, and she spent years trying to tell people what she'd done and what she'd seen, and eventually the weight of not being believed, it did something to her. Not broke her. She wasn't a woman who broke, but it cost her something she never got back. "I'm sorry," Caleb said. "She deserved better." His voice was steady, but the steadiness was working hard. "Mr. Morgan, what you found is what I've been trying to find for most of my adult life. My mother's name is on something real. What I need to know is what you intend to do with it." Caleb had thought about this question since the day he photographed the hidden documents. He had an answer ready. "I intend to make sure it can't be hidden again," he said. "Whatever happens with the aircraft, whatever it's worth, whatever it means to anyone, the people who built it and flew it get their names back. That's the condition. Everything else we can talk about." The silence on the other end of the line lasted several seconds. "Mr. Morgan," Adrian Sterling said, and his voice had changed. The control was still there, but something behind it had shifted. "I think we need to meet." Victoria Collins was in her car, in her company parking lot, when her phone rang. It was her personal attorney, not her company counsel. The distinction mattered. "We have a problem," he said without preamble. "Tell me." Adrian Sterling's legal team made contact this morning. They've identified the Phoenix X1 prototype as an asset with historical and legal significance connected to a former Avery Collins aviation acquisition. They are currently in communication with the mechanic who purchased it at auction. Victoria closed her eyes briefly. "They've made contact with him." "They have. And if what I'm hearing is accurate, the aircraft contains documentation that predates your tenure. Documentation that may show how it came into your company's possession and what was known about it at the time." She thought about Richard Hale in her office. Historical complexities, prior to my tenure. "What's Sterling looking for?" she asked. "He wants the aircraft publicly attributed to its original program. He wants the historical record corrected. He wants his mother's name restored." A pause. "He also has the resources to make this very publicly uncomfortable for anyone associated with suppressing that record." Victoria said nothing. "Victoria, if this goes public without your cooperation, the story is about what your company buried. If you get in front of it, the story is about what you helped uncover." She looked through her windshield at the building her family had built. Her great-grandfather's name on the sign, her father's offices on the 3rd floor, the hangars beyond where mechanics worked on aircraft that still flew. She thought about a 222 bill of sale. She thought about a man in a faded jacket who had raised his hand in an auction hall while everyone else was looking at their phones. She picked up her pen. "Set up a meeting," she said. 7 days later, Caleb Morgan was sitting in the conference room of a hotel in Nashville, not his choice of venue, not his territory, not his world, wearing the best clothes he owned, which were clean and pressed, but would never be mistaken for expensive. He had brought Patricia Oakes, who sat to his left with a legal pad and an expression of professional calm. Across the table sat Adrian Sterling and 2 members of his legal team. The door opened and Victoria Collins walked in. Alone. No assistants, no Dana with the tablet, no security. She sat down across from Caleb. She looked at him directly, the kind of look that takes effort when you've been used to looking past people, and she said, "I want to understand what you found." Caleb looked back at her. He had the photographs on a laptop in front of him. The documents were still in the safety deposit box because Patricia had advised against bringing the originals to a first meeting. But the photographs were complete high resolution and damning. He turned the laptop around. He let her read. Victoria Collins read for 6 minutes without speaking. At one point she stopped on a page, went back, read something again. Her expression did something that Caleb hadn't expected to see on her face. It went somewhere unguarded, somewhere past the calculation and the composure. She looked up at him when she finished. "Richard Hale knew about this," she said, not a question. "From what I can tell," Caleb said. "Yes." She nodded slowly. She looked at Adrian Sterling. "Your mother flew this aircraft." "She did." "And your family has been looking for it." "For 20 years." Victoria looked back at the laptop screen for a moment, at the photograph of Samuel Whitaker's last page, at the final paragraph, at the words, "I hope they understand what it means." She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, not to her attorneys, not to Adrian Sterling's attorneys, not to Patricia, but directly to Caleb, the way one person speaks to another when they're setting the performance aside for a moment. "I sold this to you for $222. "You did," he said. She held his gaze. Something moved across her face that wasn't comfortable to watch because it was the expression of a person recognizing something about themselves they hadn't been prepared to see. "What do you need from me?" she asked. And for the first time since the auction, Caleb Morgan felt the ground under the situation firm up completely. "The truth," he said. "That's all. Just the truth." The meeting lasted 4 hours. Nobody ordered lunch. Nobody suggested a break. The kind of conversation that was happening in that conference room didn't have natural pauses. It had pressure, and the pressure kept everyone in their chairs, even after the coffee went cold and the afternoon light moved across the wall. Victoria Collins had said she wanted the truth, and Caleb had said that was all he needed from her, and for the first 20 minutes after that exchange, the lawyers on both sides had tried to reassert control over the conversation, the way lawyers do carefully, professionally, with language designed to create structure around things that were still moving too fast to structure. Adrian Sterling stopped them. I didn't do it loudly. He put one hand flat on the conference table and said, "I'd like to hear from Mr. Morgan directly if that's acceptable. We can have the attorneys formalize everything later." Victoria nodded. Caleb looked at Adrian Sterling across the table and understood for the first time in person what 20 years of sustained purpose looked like on a human face. Adrian was a large man, broad through the shoulders, with the kind of stillness that doesn't come from being calm, but from having spent a very long time learning to hold a significant weight without letting it show in your posture. His eyes, when they fixed on you, didn't let go. "Walk me through it," Adrian said. "From the beginning, everything you found and how you found it. Don't abbreviate." So Caleb did. He started with the auction. He described the serial number. He described the alloy. He went through every technical observation he had made in sequence, and he spoke with the precision of a man who knew exactly what he was talking about and didn't need to embellish it, because the facts were already remarkable without embellishment. When he got to the hidden documents, the 11 pages behind the access panel, Adrian Sterling's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes moved. Something shifted and settled the way a piece of machinery moves when it finally engages the gear it's been searching for. "He hid them inside the aircraft," Adrian said. Not a question. A man absorbing confirmation. "Yes, behind a secondary layer on one of the interior access panels. The adhesive had dried over the decades, but the documents were protected enough to be largely intact. He knew they'd come for the aircraft," Adrian said quietly, "and he put the record inside it so it couldn't be separated from the machine. Whatever happened to the helicopter, the story was in there with it." "That's what I think," Caleb said. Victoria had been listening without speaking, and she spoke now carefully, like someone choosing each word before releasing it. "The aircraft came into our inventory in 1977, 3 years after the program officially ended. I went back through our records this morning before this meeting. The acquisition is listed as a transfer from a federal surplus disposal account. No description beyond rotary wing airframe non-operational. No engineering designation. No serial number cross-referenced in our system. It appears in our records the same way a filing cabinet or a set of floor mats would appear." She paused. "Whoever transferred it went to significant effort to make it invisible." "Because invisible things don't get investigated," Patricia said. "No," Victoria said. "They don't." She looked at the laptop at the photographs of the documents still visible on the screen. "I need to ask you directly, Mr. Morgan. Richard Hale, did he contact you before our legal team sent the letter?" "He called me personally 3 days after the auction," Caleb said. "He suggested there were documentation discrepancies and implied my ownership could be legally challenged. He also suggested I shouldn't invest too much in the aircraft. His phrasing was, he said these things have a way of becoming complicated for people who aren't prepared for the complications." Victoria's jaw set. It was the only external sign of what that information cost her to hear. "He told me this morning before I drove to this meeting that he's been aware of the aircraft's significance since before I became CEO," she said. "Since before my father's stroke, which means he's been aware of it for potentially my entire tenure. He managed that information for his own purposes. What those purposes were precisely I intend to find out." "He tried to protect something," Adrian said. "The question is whether he was protecting himself, protecting someone else, or both." "Both most likely," Patricia said. "In my experience, those things tend to overlap." The room went quiet for a moment, not uncomfortably, but the way a room goes quiet when several people are each processing something significant. It was Adrian who broke the silence, and when he did, he turned to Caleb with a directness that cut through everything else in the room. "What do you want from this, Mr. Morgan?" he asked. "Not as a legal matter, not as a negotiation, as a man. What do you want?" Caleb had thought about this question. He'd thought about it the night he found the documents sitting on the concrete floor of his garage. He'd thought about it on the drive to Nashville that morning, while Lily waved from the front porch and made him promise to text when he arrived. He'd thought about it in the elevator on the way up to this conference room in the 45 seconds between the lobby and the 7th floor, when he'd looked at his own reflection in the elevator door and asked himself one final time whether he was sure. "I want Claire Whitmore's name on the aircraft," he said. "Her full name and her role, lead test pilot, not a footnote, not an acknowledgement, on the aircraft itself. I want Samuel Whitaker's contribution documented completely and publicly, not buried in an academic paper nobody reads. I want the 11 pages he hid in that aircraft to be part of the public record, his words in his handwriting exactly as he wrote them." He paused. "And I want the aircraft in a place where people can see it. Not a private collection, not a warehouse, somewhere people go." Adrian looked at him for a long moment. "The Sterling Aerospace Museum," he said. "If that's where it can be seen, it's where it belongs." Adrian looked at the table for a moment, and when he looked up again, something had changed in his face. The composure was still there, but behind it was something rawer, something that had been kept in a room by itself for a long time. "My mother spent the last years of her life not bitter. I don't want to say bitter because that's not accurate. She was clear-eyed about what had happened. She knew exactly what had been done and why. But she carried it. She carried the weight of having done something real and having no way to show anyone the evidence." He stopped. Nobody rushed to fill the silence. "If this aircraft is real, and I know it is, I know it from everything you've described, then the evidence exists. She wasn't wrong. She wasn't imagining it. She flew a helicopter in November 1973 that was 50 years ahead of what anyone was publicly developing, and the only reason anyone can say it didn't happen is because someone decided to make the proof disappear." His voice was still controlled, but the control was the thin kind, the kind stretched over something that had been held under pressure for a very long time. "She was right, and I want the world to know she was right." Caleb nodded. "She was right," he said simply. Adrian Sterling looked at Caleb Morgan across a conference room table, a billionaire and a mechanic, a man who had spent 20 years building an empire, and a man who had spent 20 years fixing things other people had given up on, and neither of them said anything for a moment. They didn't need to. What came next was both simpler and more complicated than Caleb had expected. The simpler part was Adrian Sterling. Once they were aligned on the conditions, Claire's name, Whitaker's documents, public display. Adrian moved with the efficiency of a man who had been waiting 2 decades to have something to move toward. His team was organized, resourceful, and accustomed to complex situations. Within 72 hours of the Nashville meeting, Caleb had been connected with Adrian's chief legal counsel, his head of historical research, and an aerospace engineering consultant named Dr. Miriam Tate, who had spent 30 years studying rotary wing development, and whose reaction when she reviewed Caleb's photographs of the aircraft and the documents was to say the word remarkable 4 times in a row without seeming to notice she was repeating herself. The more complicated part was everything else. The morning after the Nashville meeting, Victoria Collins returned to her office and summoned Richard Hale. Caleb wasn't there for that conversation. He would piece together what happened from subsequent events and from what Victoria told him much later, when enough time had passed that she could talk about it without the careful professional composure she usually wore like armor. Hale had come into her office expecting negotiation. He had spent 30 years in aviation finance, and in 30 years, he had learned that almost everything was a negotiation if you stayed in the room long enough and kept your language precise enough. He came in with his hands in front of him, not raised in surrender, but open, presenting the posture of a man offering terms. Victoria didn't accept the posture. She had spent the previous evening with her personal attorney going through every record she could access related to the aircraft's acquisition and storage history. She had found what she'd expected to find: a chain of documentation that was too clean, too bare, too deliberately uninformative to be accidental. The aircraft had been brought in under a transfer description that stripped away every identifying characteristic. The internal memo recommending storage rather than disposal, which she'd found in a scan of archived files from 1977, had been authored by a man who had since died, but attached to it was a handwritten note in the margin that Hale had written in the early years of his tenure, instructing the storage facility, "Do not list for sale or disposal without directorial approval." His handwriting, his instruction, 20-some years old, but his. "You knew what it was," Victoria said when Hale sat down across from her. "I knew it was something that needed to be handled carefully. You knew it was a suppressed prototype connected to a program that was deliberately buried. and you kept that information to yourself for over 2 decades and let me almost sell it at a public auction to the first bidder. I was protecting. Don't. Her voice wasn't loud. It never needed to be. Don't say you were protecting the company. You were protecting yourself. If that aircraft's history became public, the questions about who knew what and when would start with you, not with me, not with my father, with you. Hale looked at her. Your father knew, he said. Not all of it, but enough. The room went very still. Say that again, Victoria said. When the aircraft came into our inventory, your father was the one who signed the transfer acceptance. I don't believe he understood the full significance, but he knew it wasn't a standard asset, and he chose not to ask questions he didn't want the answers to. Hale paused. I was protecting the record that connected him to that decision. Victoria sat back in her chair. She was quiet for a long time. My father, she said finally, is 78 years old and recovering from his second stroke. Whatever decisions he made 40 years ago, he's not in a position to account for them now, and I'm not going to let you use his name as a shield. She stood up. Your access to company records is suspended immediately. You'll speak to our general counsel this afternoon. If you withhold anything, if you destroy anything, if you contact anyone at Dawson Price and Associates or anyone else about this matter without explicit authorization, I will make sure that every regulator with jurisdiction over your professional conduct hears exactly what you've told me in this room. She walked to the door. Victoria, his voice had changed. The professional composure was entirely gone. What was underneath it was older, smaller, more afraid. I've been with this company for 31 years. She stopped with her hand on the door. She turned around and looked at him. Really looked at him the way she hadn't looked at people in years, because looking at people the way she was looking at him right now showed you things about them and about yourself that were uncomfortable to see. I know, she said. And in 31 years you had dozens of chances to make a different choice. About that aircraft, about those documents, about my father, about the people whose names were erased from history. She paused. You didn't make those choices, so now we're here. She left. Caleb heard about the suspension from Patricia, who had heard it from a contact in the Nashville legal community. He heard about it on a Friday evening standing in his garage where he had spent the previous 3 weeks methodically cleaning and stabilizing every accessible section of the Phoenix X-1's airframe while Dr. Miriam Tate consulted remotely on the process. He set down the cloth he'd been using and stood in the middle of his garage processing the news. Lily appeared in the doorway from the house. She'd gotten better at reading the specific quality of his silences over the previous few weeks, the difference between the focused silence of a man working and the different silence of a man sitting with something. What happened? She asked. Hale is suspended. Avery Collins Aviation is cooperating with the investigation. She came into the garage and sat on the old shop stool she'd claimed as her own sometime around the 3rd week of the project. She looked at the helicopter, which had been gradually transformed from the burned-out wreck he'd bought at auction into something that was beginning to look like it had once been intentionally built. Is it over? She asked. No, he said. It's just starting. What does that mean? I thought about how to explain it to a 10-year-old. Then he decided that Lily didn't need it simplified, she needed it honest. The hard part of finding something that was buried, he said, isn't finding it. It's what happens after. Because the people who buried it, some of them are still around. And even the ones who aren't around anymore left things behind. Reputations, records, decisions that affected other decisions that are still affecting things now. Untangling all of that takes time. And during that time, a lot of people get uncomfortable. Lily looked at the helicopter. Are you uncomfortable? She asked. I thought about it genuinely. No, he said. I'm the most comfortable I've been with something in a long time, because I know what I'm doing, and I know why. She nodded slowly. Mom would have liked this, she said. He looked at her. It was the kind of thing she said occasionally, not often, not to make a point just because it was true, and she wanted it said. Her mother had died 4 years ago, and Lily handled the loss the way she handled most things, with a quiet clarity that sometimes startled people who expected a 10-year-old to handle grief less precisely. Yeah, Caleb said. She would have. Dr. Miriam Tate arrived in person 10 days later. She drove herself from Nashville in a 12-year-old Subaru, which she parked precisely in the center of the available space in Caleb's driveway. She was 63 years old, small with short gray hair, and the kind of posture that suggested she had spent most of her career standing in hangars and had long since stopped caring about chairs. She carried a canvas bag full of technical instruments and a hardcover notebook that looked like it had been to several continents. She shook Caleb's hand with a firm grip and said, "I've reviewed every photograph you sent. I have 17 questions, and I expect you to have the answers to at least 12 of them." "Okay," Caleb said. "Let's start with the rotor hub attachment geometry, because if this aircraft has what I think it has based on the photographs, it represents a solution to a problem that the industry spent 15 years trying to solve after this program ended, and it's going to change what several aerospace historians have been saying in print for the last 30 years. "All right," he said. "Come look." She stepped into the garage and stopped. She stood in front of the helicopter for a full 30 seconds without speaking or moving, not performing the moment, just absorbing it. Then she walked forward and began with the particular focus of an expert in the presence of the thing they've spent their career looking for, to look. Over the next 6 hours, Caleb answered her 17 questions. He answered 15 of them correctly. The other 2 she answered herself, talking through the engineering logic in a rapid, dense monologue that he followed about 80% of and found fascinating throughout. By late afternoon, she sat down on the shop stool. Lily wasn't home from school yet, and looked at him with an expression that was professional and also just barely emotional. "This is the real thing," she said. "I want to be clear about what I'm telling you. This is not an experimental variant of a production model. This is not a modified airframe. This is the Phoenix X1. The engineering decisions in this airframe are too specific, too non-standard, too consistent with what Whitaker published in his 1971 paper to be anything else. The solutions in here, the rotor control geometry, the vibration management, the frame load distribution, these are genuine innovations. They didn't appear in mainstream aviation development until the late 1980s and early 1990s, and when they appeared as if people had independently derived them." She paused. "They didn't independently derive them. They caught up with Whitaker 20 years later." "And Claire Whitmore flew it," Caleb said. "She flew it in 1973, and the flight data in Whitaker's documents, if those numbers are accurate, and I have every reason to believe they are, she flew it successfully. The aircraft performed." Dr. Tate stopped for a moment, and the professional composure did something it clearly wasn't used to doing. "Do you understand what it means that she flew this, and nobody knew a woman in 1973 flying an experimental aircraft that was 50 years ahead of its time, and the official record said it never happened?" "I understand," Caleb said. "I want to write the technical paper," she said. "I want to be clear that's a personal interest, not a condition. But I want to document this properly and completely. Whitaker's contributions, Claire's flight, the engineering innovations, all of it. I want there to be a paper with citations and peer review that puts this permanently into the technical record where it cannot be removed." "I'd like that," Caleb said. She nodded briskly, the professional composure clicking back into place. "Good. Then we're aligned." 2 weeks after Miriam Tate's visit, Adrian Sterling came to Tennessee. He came without announcement beyond a brief text the previous evening, "I'll be there tomorrow morning if that works for you," and arrived in a car driven by someone else, which he got out of alone and walked across the gravel toward Caleb's shop with his hands in his coat pockets. Caleb met him at the door. They shook hands without the formality of the Nashville meeting because this was a different kind of visit. That meeting had been about positions and conditions and the choreography of people trying to establish trust across a significant gap. This was something else. "I wanted to see it," Adrian said simply. "Come in," Caleb said. He led him into the garage. Adrian Sterling stopped in the doorway. He stood there looking at the helicopter at the aircraft his mother had flown on a November morning when he was 8 years old, and she had come home lit up from the inside, and he didn't move for a long time. Caleb stepped back and gave him space. He watched Adrian's face while he looked at the aircraft. He watched the careful composure of a man who had built an empire and spent 20 years searching, and had finally walked into a room and found the thing he'd been looking for. Composure held. And then it didn't. Not completely. Adrian Sterling was not a man who fell apart, and this was not a moment of falling apart. But something moved through him that was private and real and visible, and he let it be visible for the length of time it took him to walk from the doorway to the aircraft and put his hand on the airframe. He stood with his hand flat against the fuselage for a moment. Then he said very quietly to the helicopter, or to himself, or to someone who wasn't in the room, "She flew you." Caleb said nothing. After a moment, Adrian turned around. His face was composed again, but the edges of the composure were different, softer, like something had been resolved inside it. "Thank you," he said, "for buying it, for not selling it back, for not letting it disappear." "I didn't know what it was yet when I bought it," Caleb said. "But you looked," Adrian said. "Everybody else walked past it for 11 years. You looked." He paused. "My mother spent a long time looking for people who would look, for people who would actually pay attention to what was in front of them instead of what they expected to see." Caleb thought about the auction hall, about the sound of laughter when he raised his hand. "I know something about that," he said. Adrian looked at him for a moment. "Yes, I imagine you do." They stood together in the garage for a while, not talking the way two people stand together when the situation has already said what needs to be said, and talking would only reduce it. Then Adrian reached into his jacket and produced a folded piece of paper. He held it out. Caleb took it and unfolded it. It was a check. The number on it was $20 million. Caleb looked at it for a long time, longer than it takes to read a number. He was reading something else, reading what the number meant, what it represented, what accepting it would and wouldn't resolve. "This is what the aircraft is worth to me," Adrian said. "Not its market value, not its historical valuation. What it is worth to me personally to have found what I've been looking for." "My conditions stand," Caleb said. He held up the check slightly. "This doesn't change them." "I know. My team has already drafted the agreements. Claire's name on the aircraft in the museum, Whitaker's documents in the public archive, full attribution in Miriam's paper, permanent public display." He paused. "Those aren't concessions, Mr. Morgan. Those were always the point." Caleb folded the check. He held it in his hand. He thought about his 222, about Lily asking if he was sure, about Earl Pemberton in a hangar in Tennessee saying a machine tells its story, about 11 pages hidden behind an access panel for 50 years, about a woman flying an aircraft on a November morning and coming home lit up and never being believed. He thought about all the things people walk past because they've already decided what they're looking at. "I have one more condition," he said. Adrian waited. "The training program for young mechanics from ordinary backgrounds, people who have the skill but don't have the connections or the resources to get somewhere with it. I want to fund it properly. Not a gesture, a real program sustainable with a facility and instructors and a pipeline." He looked at the check. "That's what I'm using this for, most of it. I want your foundation to partner with it." Adrian was quiet for a moment. "Done," he said. "Just like that." "My mother spent her career being dismissed because of who she was and where she came from," Adrian said. "If I can't say yes to that, then the museum is just a building." He extended his hand. "Done." They shook on it. Later that evening, after Adrian Sterling had gone, Caleb sat at his kitchen table. Lily was doing homework across from him. The check was in his wallet. The garage was quiet. The helicopter sat in the dark, waiting the same way it had been waiting for 50 years, patient, in the particular way of things that are real, and know they are real, and trust without certainty that eventually someone will come along and confirm it. "Dad," Lily said without looking up from her homework. "Yeah." Marcus's dad texted Marcus again. "What did he say?" "He said he heard you got a lot of money for the helicopter." Caleb smiled at the table. "What did you tell Marcus?" She looked up. "I told him it wasn't about the money." He looked at his daughter. "You're right," he said. She went back to her homework. He sat at the kitchen table and thought about tomorrow when the real work would begin, the authentication process, the legal filings, the historical documentation, the careful dismantling and transport of an aircraft that had survived 50 years in the dark and was now for the first time going to be seen. He thought about the wall of names at the museum that didn't exist yet, about the first young mechanic who would walk into a training program that didn't exist yet, about Victoria Collins, who had asked what he needed from her and was still in the process of finding out what the honest answer to that question required her to give. He thought about Richard Hale, who had made his choices over 30 years and was now living inside them. He thought about Samuel Whitaker writing 11 pages in 1974, hiding them in the wall of an aircraft he was about to lose, trusting something he couldn't be sure of. He picked up his phone and looked at the picture he'd taken of Whitaker's final paragraph. "I hope they understand what it means." He set the phone down. He understood. The authentication process took 11 weeks. Caleb had expected complications. What he hadn't expected was the particular shape those complications would take, not obstructions, not legal interference, not the kind of active resistance that Richard Hale had tried in the early days. What he got instead was something more exhausting in a different way, the slow, methodical machinery of experts who needed to be certain before they would say anything out loud. Dr. Miriam Tate coordinated the technical team. She brought in 2 additional aerospace engineers, one from Georgia Tech, one retired from a career that had included classified rotary wing programs he could only reference obliquely, and the 3 of them spent the better part of 6 weeks going through the Phoenix X-1 the way archaeologists go through a site, carefully, with documentation at every stage, with the understanding that what they found would need to survive scrutiny from people who had professional reasons to be skeptical. Caleb was present for most of it. He answered questions, provided access, and stayed out of the way when staying out of the way was what was needed. He had learned over the years that there are 2 kinds of patience in mechanical work: the patience of doing and the patience of waiting while others do. Both require something from you. The second kind requires more. Patricia managed the legal process in parallel. The formal authentication had to happen alongside the documentation of ownership, the historical claims, the questions about what Avery Collins Aviation's liability was for the 11 years the aircraft had been in their inventory, and the separate but related question of what Richard Hale's conduct over the previous 3 decades had actually cost, and who that cost belonged to. Richard Hale had retained his own attorney within 24 hours of his suspension. His attorney was a man named Warren Stiles, who had a reputation in Nashville legal circles for being very good at making things complicated enough that people gave up trying to resolve them. Stiles sent a letter to Victoria Collins's counsel, suggesting that Hale's awareness of the aircraft's significance had been limited, that his instructions regarding the aircraft had been consistent with protecting company assets during a period of managerial uncertainty, and that any characterization of his conduct as intentionally suppressive would be vigorously contested. Victoria read the letter and sent back 3 words through her counsel: "Produce the documents," because she had found the margin note, and the margin note was in his handwriting, and the margin note was dated, and there were 14 other documents in the company archive that, taken together, told a very clear story about what Richard Hale had known when he had known it and what he had chosen to do with that knowledge. She called Caleb the evening she sent the response. It was 8:30 at night. He was in the garage working on a legitimate paying job, a turbine engine inspection that was due the following week, when his phone rang. "Miss Collins," he said, "I keep telling you to call me Victoria." She didn't sound like someone making small talk. She sounded like someone who had been sitting with something and had finally decided to say it. "I found the margin note, the one from 1989 on the storage memo. It's his handwriting. I had a handwriting analyst confirm it this morning." "I know," Caleb said. "Patricia told me." "I was protecting himself," she said. "Not my father, mostly himself. He told me my father knew, and that was true in a limited sense, but the more I read the documents, the clearer it becomes that my father didn't understand what he was signing. He signed a transfer document for a non-operational rotary airframe. He didn't know it was the Phoenix X-1. Richard knew. Richard was the one who understood what he was holding, and Richard made the decision to hold it quietly and hope nobody ever looked." Caleb set down his inspection light and leaned against the workbench. "What are you going to do about him?" A pause, the kind of pause that has weight in it. "Everything that needs to be done," she said. "I've referred the matter to the relevant regulatory bodies. His professional conduct, his management of company assets, the question of what exactly he knew about the program's historical significance, and whether that knowledge carried any legal obligations he failed to meet." Another pause. "It's not going to be simple. He's been around a long time and he has relationships and he's going to fight it." "It usually isn't simple," Caleb said. "That's not a reason." "No," she said, "it isn't." He could hear her exhale slowly. "I want to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me." "All right." "When you sat across from me in that conference room, when I asked what you needed from me and you said the truth." She paused again. "Did you think I was going to deliver it? Actually deliver it, not just say the right things in a room and then revert?" Caleb thought about it. He didn't rush the answer. "I didn't know," he said. I thought there was a real chance, because you came to Nashville alone. No assistance, no security. The way a person comes somewhere when they're not performing. I've spent a lot of years performing, she said. I know, he said. Does it show? Sometimes, he said honestly. Less now than it did 6 weeks ago. A sound on her end that might have been a short, surprised laugh, the involuntary kind that escapes before you decide to let it. That's fair, she said. You're doing the right thing with Hale, Caleb said, whatever it costs. It's going to cost something, she said. He knows where a lot of the bodies are buried, to use an unfortunate expression given the context. There are going to be things that come out that reflect badly on decisions I didn't make but inherited. A pause. I've decided I can live with that more easily than the alternative. That's how you know it's the right call, he said. She was quiet for a moment. Then, I'm going to come to the garage, before the aircraft is transported. I want to see it in the space where you did the work. Not at the museum, not at an event, just there. Come whenever you want, he said. Thank you, Mr. Morgan. Caleb, he said. A brief pause. Caleb. She came on a Wednesday morning 3 days later. She came in a different car than Caleb expected, not the company vehicle, not the executive black sedan. A regular car late model that she parked on the gravel beside his shop. She was wearing different clothes too. Not the charcoal blazer and silk blouse of the Nashville meeting, but something simpler, the kind of clothes you wear when you're going somewhere that requires actually moving around. Caleb met her at the door. They shook hands, and she followed him into the garage and stood in front of the Phoenix X1, the same way everyone stood in front of it the first time, with a pause that was involuntary, that the situation imposed on you, regardless of who you were or how composed you'd managed to stay up to that moment. She looked at it for a long time. It doesn't look like $20 million, she said. No, Caleb agreed. It looks like what it is. Which is an idea someone had, he said, and protected, long enough for someone else to find it. Victoria walked forward slowly, circling the aircraft the way he had circled it in the auction hall 8 weeks earlier. She looked at the alloy at the rotor assembly, at the places where the original paint had been cleaned back enough to show the base metal. She stopped at the nose section where the access panel had been carefully reinstalled after the documents were removed. In there, she said. Yes. He hid them in there before the transfer. She wasn't asking. He knew where it was going, and he put the record inside so it couldn't be lost without the aircraft being lost. That's what I think. She put her hand on the panel, not the way Adrian had put his hand on the fuselage, not with that particular weight of personal history, but with something genuine. I need to tell you something, she said, not turning around, about why I really put this in the auction. He waited. She turned to face him. Richard told me it was worthless. He said it was a non-operational asset with no parts value and no market. He gave me a clean recommendation: auction it for scrap, clear the inventory, move the storage space to productive use. She paused. I didn't look at the aircraft myself. I didn't ask questions. I trusted his evaluation because it was his job to evaluate these things, and because the amount we could recover was irrelevant to the company's financials either way. She looked at him steadily. I didn't look, and I should have looked. You had no reason to think you needed to, Caleb said. I had a reason, she said. The reason is that it's my company, and these are my assets, and I should understand what I'm responsible for. I delegated that understanding to a man who had reasons to keep me uninformed. She shook her head slightly. I built a career on being the smartest person in the room. The real problem with being the smartest person in the room is that you stop listening to the room. You start just listening to yourself. Caleb didn't say anything for a moment. He looked at the helicopter between them. My mentor used to say, he said, that a machine tells its story. You just have to know how to listen. She looked at him. What does that mean? It means the information is always there. Everything that was done to a machine, every decision the person who built it made, every problem they solved, it's in the metal. You can read it if you pay attention. But paying attention means getting close, getting your hands dirty, not relying on someone else's summary of what they think you need to know. She held his gaze. That applies to more than helicopters. Pretty much everything, he said. She nodded slowly. Something in her expression shifted, not dramatically, not the kind of shift that made a story to tell people afterward. Just a quiet internal adjustment, the kind that matters more than the dramatic ones because it stays. The formal investigation into Richard Hale's conduct became public 6 weeks after his suspension. It didn't become public the way Caleb had expected, not through a press release, not through a legal filing that got picked up by aviation trade publications. It became public because a journalist named Karen Loy, who covered aerospace and technology for a national publication, and who had been independently researching the disappearance of the Phoenix X-1 program for 3 years, had received a tip from a source inside the aviation historical community about an aircraft that had surfaced in a Tennessee mechanic's garage. She called Caleb's shop on a Tuesday afternoon. He was with a customer when the call came in. He called her back 45 minutes later, standing in the parking lot of his shop with the afternoon sun cutting across the gravel. "Mr. Morgan," she said, "I've been researching the Phoenix X-1 for 3 years. I know about Samuel Whitaker and Claire Whitmore and the Advanced Rotary Research Initiative. I know about the official record saying the prototype was destroyed. I have reason to believe you found it." "Who told you?" he asked. "I protect my sources," she said. "But I'll tell you that it wasn't anyone connected to Adrian Sterling's team or Patricia Oakes's office." I thought about that. The aviation historical community was small. Dr. Tate had reached out to colleagues. Word traveled in small communities. "What do you want to know?" he asked. "Everything," she said. "But specifically, can you confirm you found the Phoenix X-1? Can you confirm the documents you found inside it? And can you tell me what the investigation of Richard Hale is actually about? Because what I'm hearing suggests it goes further than one financial director at one aviation company." Caleb leaned against the wall of his shop and looked at the sky for a moment. He called Patricia immediately after ending the call with Karen Loy. "A journalist named Karen Loy just called me," he said. Patricia was quiet for exactly 2 seconds. "What did she say?" he told her. "Don't confirm or deny anything until we talk to Adrian's team," Patricia said. "This is actually not necessarily bad news, but we need to control the timing." "She's going to publish something whether we talk to her or not," Caleb said. "I know, which means we're better off talking to her than not." A pause. "Let me make 2 calls. I'll get back to you in an hour." The calls that Patricia made that afternoon set in motion a sequence of events that Caleb would look back on later as the moment when the story stopped being something that was happening in his garage and became something that was happening in the world. Adrian Sterling's team agreed to coordinate with Karen Loy under specific conditions. The authentication process had to be complete, which it nearly was. The legal filings had to be submitted, which they were in the final stages of being prepared. And Claire Whitmore Sterling's contribution had to be the centerpiece of whatever Karen Loy published, not a supporting detail in someone else's narrative. Karen Loy agreed to those terms immediately. She'd spent 3 years researching a story that everyone she'd pitched it to had considered marginal, an old experimental program, a disputed prototype, a woman pilot whose name had been erased from a record that most people didn't know existed. She had kept pursuing it because she'd understood intuitively what Caleb had understood mechanically. The information was in there. You just had to be willing to get close enough to read it. Her article ran 5 weeks later. It was long, the kind of long that publications rarely allow anymore because long means you're asking something of your reader. It was 6,000 words, and it began with Claire Whitmore climbing into the cockpit of an aircraft on a November morning in 1973, and it ended with Caleb Morgan raising his hand in an auction hall while everyone around him laughed. The response was not subtle. Caleb's phone rang 37 times on the day the article published. He answered 11 of them. The other 26, he let go to voicemail, which filled up by 2 in the afternoon. Lily came home from school and found him sitting at the kitchen table with his phone face down in front of him and a cup of coffee that had gone cold. "I saw the article," she said. "Marcus showed me at lunch. He said his dad saw it." "What did Marcus's dad say?" Lily set her backpack down and sat across from him. "Marcus said his dad didn't say anything. He just showed Marcus the article and pointed to your name." Caleb picked up the coffee and looked at it and set it back down. "How do you feel?" Lily asked. "Strange," he said. "Good strange or bad strange?" He thought about it. The kind of strange where something you did by yourself for a long time is suddenly happening in public, and the two things don't quite feel like the same thing. She nodded like she understood, which she probably did, because she was Lily. "The helicopter is still in our garage," she said. "That part is still real." "Yeah," he said. "It is." "Then it's okay," she said. She picked up his cold coffee and took it to the microwave without asking. "What do you need to do today?" "Finish the turbine inspection for Patterson," he said. "It's due tomorrow." "Then go do that," she said. He looked at his daughter, 10 years old, managing him with the kind of calm practicality that would have made her mother laugh and reach for her hand at the same time. "You're right," he said. "I know," she said. He went back to work. 3 days after the article published, Richard Hale resigned. He didn't do it publicly. He submitted a letter through his attorney to Victoria Collins's counsel, effective immediately, citing personal reasons. No statement, no interview. He left the building he had occupied for 31 years without speaking to anyone on his way out, according to the assistant who saw him leave. Victoria sent Caleb a text that evening. Just 2 words, "He's gone." Caleb read it and set his phone back on the bench. He didn't feel satisfaction. He'd expected to feel something sharper, and instead what he felt was quieter than that particular feeling of a pressure that has been present for so long, you stopped noticing it releasing. Not triumph, just air. What came in the days after Hale's resignation was more complicated than Caleb had prepared for, even though Patricia had warned him that the story's public emergence would bring people and attention he hadn't been seeking. Former colleagues of Samuel Whitaker's reached out through the foundation men in their 80s and 90s, some of them who had worked on the edges of the ARI program and had spent 50 years wondering what had happened to the prototype. One man, a retired engineer named Howard Costas, sent a letter, an actual letter, handwritten describing a conversation he'd had with Whitaker in 1974, weeks before the program ended. Caleb read the letter twice and then called Howard Costas, who was 81 years old and lived in Florida, and who cried on the phone when Caleb confirmed that the documents behind the access panel included Whitaker's final note. He knew nobody would listen in 1974. Howard said, his voice steady but thin. "He said to me, this is the last thing he said to me before he left. He said, 'Howard, the truth doesn't disappear. It just waits.' And then he left and I never heard from him again." Caleb sat with that for a long time after the call ended. The truth doesn't disappear. It just waits. He thought about the Phoenix X-1 sitting in Avery Collins Aviation's secondary hangar for 11 years, not moving, not speaking, just waiting for someone to look closely enough. He called Adrian Sterling. "Whitaker said something to a colleague in 1974, Caleb said, before he disappeared. He said the truth doesn't disappear, it just waits." A long pause on the other end. "I was right," Adrian said. "I want that on the museum," Caleb said. "Somewhere visible, not a plaque buried in a corner, somewhere people actually see it." "I'll make it happen," Adrian said. "What's the rest of the quote?" "That's all of it," Caleb said. "It doesn't need to be longer." The transport of the Phoenix X-1 happened on a Saturday morning in early autumn, 8 weeks after Karen Loy's article published. Caleb had arranged the specialized transport through Adrian's team, with Dr. Tate supervising the rigging and loading process. The aircraft had been carefully prepared, stabilized, documented in its current state, protected for transit. Lily had asked if she could watch it leave. He'd said yes. She stood beside him in the driveway as the transport vehicle maneuvered into position. She was wearing her school jacket the same olive green as his because she'd found it at a second-hand store and bought it with her own money and presented it to him one evening with the announcement that they matched now, which had made him feel something in his chest that didn't have a clean name. The loading process took 2 hours. When it was done, when the aircraft was secured and the transport was ready to move, Lily reached over and took his hand. Not dramatically, just the way you reach for something that's there. They stood there watching until the vehicle turned out of sight at the end of the road. Caleb looked at the empty garage. For 9 weeks, the Phoenix X-1 had occupied that space, and in that time the garage had been the center of something he hadn't fully understood while it was happening. Now the space was empty and the work was done, and the helicopter that everyone had called worthless was on its way to the museum where it would be seen. "You okay?" Lily asked. "Yeah," he said. "I'm okay." She looked at him sideways. "You're going to miss it." "I'm going to miss working on it," he said. "That's different." "Is it?" He thought about it. The working on it was mine. What it is, what it means, that was always going to be something larger than me. That part belongs to more people. He squeezed her hand. "I was just the one who looked." She was quiet for a moment. "Mom would say that's enough," she said. "Yeah," he said. "She would." They went inside. The meeting with Victoria Collins that neither of them had scheduled happened 2 days before the museum opening. She called in the morning and asked if she could come by the shop that afternoon. Just to talk, she said. No lawyers, no agenda. He said yes. She came at 3 o'clock and parked and came in and sat in the chair across from his desk, the one customers sat in when they came to discuss jobs and looked around at the shop, at the tools hung in their proper places on the wall, at the legal pad stacked on the corner of the desk, at the framed 222 bill of sale that Caleb had not yet decided where to put permanently, but which was currently propped against the wall above his coffee maker. She looked at the bill of sale for a long moment. I signed that without reading it, she said. I know. I didn't even look at the helicopter in person before I authorized the auction. I looked at a line item in an inventory report. She paused. My financial director told me it was worthless, and I believed him, because believing him was more convenient than finding out for myself. People do that, Caleb said. People with resources and responsibility shouldn't do that, she said. It's a different thing. She looked at him. I've been making changes to how the company operates. Before anything is decommissioned or disposed of any asset with a historical designation, any aircraft with an unusual origin record, it goes to a review panel. People who know aviation history, not just aviation finance. That's a good change, he said. It's obvious, she said. It should have always been the policy. It wasn't because the people setting the policy were measuring everything in dollars and nothing else. She stopped. I built my reputation on being ruthlessly efficient. I'm realizing that ruthless efficiency without adequate understanding is just confident negligence. Caleb didn't say anything. I'm also funding the historical archive, she said. Adrian's team and mine have been talking. The Sterling Foundation will manage the museum and the primary archive. But Avery Collins is contributing a secondary archive documentation from our complete asset history going back to my grandfather's time, properly cataloged, accessible to researchers. She paused. If there are other things in our history that someone needs to look at, I'd rather someone look at them on purpose than discover them by accident at a $220 auction. He looked at her. 6 weeks ago, in this same chair, she'd been wearing the charcoal blazer and the composure-like matched luggage. She was still composed. She would always be composed. It was part of how she was built, but the composition was different now. More real, less performed. You didn't have to do any of this, he said. I didn't have to, she agreed. But some things you do not because you have to, but because you finally understand what it costs to not do them. She stood up. Are you coming to the opening? Yes, he said. Good. She extended her hand across his desk, and he shook it, and she held it for a moment before releasing. Thank you, Caleb, for not selling it back, for not letting us make it disappear again. It was never going to disappear, he said. It was just waiting. She tilted her head slightly. He pointed at the framed bill of sale on the wall above the coffee maker. Below it he had written the words from Whitaker's letter to Howard Costas in black marker on a strip of white tape. The truth doesn't disappear. It just waits. She read it. She nodded once. And then she went out to her car and drove away, and Caleb sat alone in his shop for a moment with the particular quiet of a person who has carried something a long way and can feel finally that the carrying is almost done. Not all the way done, but almost. The Sterling Aerospace Museum opened on a Saturday in late October, and the sky that morning was the kind of clear that only comes after several days of rain, the particular blue that looks scrubbed clean, like someone had gone over it carefully and left it better than they found it. Caleb drove himself. He had been offered transportation by Adrian's team, a car, a driver, the full treatment, and he had thanked them and declined. He drove the same truck he'd driven to the auction 11 weeks earlier, the same faded upholstery, the same slight hesitation in the engine on cold starts that he kept meaning to address and kept deprioritizing because it wasn't serious enough to interrupt paying work. Lily was in the passenger seat wearing her olive green jacket, her hair pulled back the way she wore it when she wanted to look like she was paying attention to something important. She had her window down 2 inches despite the October cool, and she was watching the landscape move past with the focused expression she got when she was processing something she hadn't finished working through yet. They drove for 40 minutes without either of them saying much, which was comfortable because it had always been comfortable between them. The absence of words as a form of presence, rather than its opposite. Are you nervous? Lily asked when they were about 10 minutes out. No, he said. Then, a little. Why? He thought about it. Because today it stops being mine." She turned to look at him. "It was never really yours." "I know," he said, "but it felt like it was while I was working on it. In the garage it was mine. Today it becomes everyone's." "Isn't that better?" He kept his eyes on the road. "Yeah," he said, "it is. That doesn't mean the other thing wasn't real." Lily looked forward again. "Both things can be true," she said. "Yes," he said, "they can." She reached over and turned on the radio, not to find something specific, just to fill the last few miles with sound, the way she'd done since she was small enough that her feet didn't reach the floor of the truck. He let her find a station without comment. When she settled on something, he reached over and turned it up slightly, and she gave him a sideways look of mild surprise, because he usually asked her to turn it down, and he shrugged, and she smiled, and they drove the last 10 minutes with the radio up, and the window cracked, and the October sky doing what it was doing above them. Tcha! The museum was not what Caleb had expected. He had imagined something institutional, the kind of building that announces itself architecturally as important, with the blank seriousness of a place that has decided in advance that you should be impressed. What Adrian had built was different. It was large but not ostentatious. The design let the light in. You could see the aircraft from the entrance through glass that ran the full height of the main hall, so that the first thing you saw when you walked toward the building was the collection itself. Not the building, not the facade, but the machines. Caleb stopped when he saw it through the glass. The Phoenix X1 was positioned in the center of the main hall, elevated on a low platform that let visitors walk around its complete circumference. Half the aircraft was in its original damaged state, the paint gone, the surfaces marked by whatever had come before the evidence of 50 years of waiting visible in the metal itself. The other half had been restored to its original condition, the rotor blades straight, the surfaces clean, the engineering decisions that Caleb had traced with his hands in his garage, now visible and legible in the way that things become visible and legible when someone finally gives them the space to be seen. Above the aircraft, suspended from the ceiling of the main hall, was a single line of text in large, clean letters. "The truth doesn't disappear, it just waits." Lily, standing beside him, read it and then looked at her father. I was looking at the museum entrance and not moving, and she understood without asking that this was a moment he needed to have before the day proceeded, a moment that was just his between the truck and the door, where he could absorb the distance between where he had started and where he was standing now. She waited. After a moment, he exhaled. "Okay," he said. "Okay," she said. They went in. The atrium was already full when they entered. Not the carefully arranged crowd of an official ceremony that would come later, but the particular energy of people who had come early because they couldn't wait, who were moving through the space with the alert, absorbed attention of visitors who genuinely wanted to look. Caleb recognized some faces. Dr. Miriam Tate was near the Phoenix X1 talking to two people he didn't know with the animated precision she brought to technical discussions. Patricia Oakes was near the entrance talking on her phone, and she caught his eye and gave him a brief nod that contained about 11 things simultaneously, which was efficient even by her standards. Howard Costas was there. Caleb saw him from across the atrium, a small man in his 80s moving slowly with the assistance of a cane, being guided carefully by a younger man who was probably his son. Howard was looking at the Phoenix X1 from 20 feet away with an expression that Caleb recognized because he had felt it himself, the expression of a person who has believed in something for a very long time and is now standing in front of the proof that they were right to believe. He crossed the atrium and put out his hand. "Mr. Costas." Howard looked at him. His eyes were sharp and clear, in a face that had aged considerably. He took Caleb's hand with both of his and held it. "You found it," Howard said. His voice was the thin but steady voice of the letter, the same voice Caleb had heard on the phone now in the room, now standing in front of the aircraft, that Samuel Whitaker had asked them both across 5 decades to find. "Sam always said someone would find it. I thought for a long time I thought he was wrong, or that I wouldn't live to see it." "He was right," Caleb said. "He usually was." Howard looked past him at the helicopter. "He was a remarkable man. They called him difficult. He wasn't difficult. He was just right when other people weren't ready to be wrong." He looked back at Caleb. "Where did you find the documents?" "Behind the interior access panel on the port side. He built a secondary layer into the panel backing, sealed it with adhesive." Howard nodded slowly, processing that. "He did it himself," he said. "He didn't tell any of us he was doing it. He would have done it alone at night before they came to take the aircraft." He paused. "He trusted the machine to carry it." "He was right about that too," Caleb said. Howard held his hand for another moment, then released it. He looked back at the aircraft. "Claire's name," he said. "Is it on there?" Come see," Caleb said. He walked Howard Costa slowly across the atrium toward the Phoenix X1, the younger man who was indeed his son Michael, walking on Howard's other side. When they reached the platform, Caleb pointed to the placard on the right side of the display, large enough to read from the visitor path, clear and unambiguous in its language. Phoenix X1 Advanced Rotary Research Initiative, 1968 to 1974. Chief Engineer Dr. Samuel Whitaker, Lead Test Pilot Claire Whitmore Sterling. Test flight record, November 14, 1973. Performance results confirmed all primary design objectives. Howard read it. He read it again. His son put a hand on his shoulder, and Howard covered that hand with his own and stood there reading Claire Whitmore Sterling's name on a placard in a museum for a long moment. 50 years, Howard said quietly to nobody in particular. 50 years, Caleb agreed. Adrian Sterling found Caleb an hour later when the formal ceremony was 20 minutes from starting and the atrium had filled considerably. He looked today like a man who had put something down, not emptied, the opposite, like a man who had been carrying something in addition to everything else he carried for a very long time, and who had finally found the right place to set it, and who was now standing a little straighter because of it. He shook Caleb's hand and held it longer than a professional handshake. "How does it look?" Caleb asked. "Like something real," Adrian said. "That's all I ever wanted it to look like. Not polished, not performed, real." He looked at the aircraft. "My mother would have—" He stopped himself, started again. She was never a sentimental person. She didn't want to be celebrated. She wanted to be right, to have it known that what she did was real and that the result was what she said it was. He paused. "She's right. It's known. That's what today is." "Yes," Caleb said. "I want to show you something," Adrian said, "before the ceremony starts." He led Caleb through the main hall to a smaller room off the left side, a gallery quieter with lower light and a more intimate scale. The room held documents and photographs and technical drawings. The 11 pages that Samuel Whitaker had hidden in the aircraft were displayed in a case at the center of the room, each page visible under glass, the faded handwriting legible to anyone who leaned in to read. Caleb stood at the case and looked at the pages. He had read them so many times he could have recited them, but seeing them here behind glass in a museum, preserved and presented and surrounded by context, was different from seeing them on his workbench with a flashlight at midnight. Different from photographing them in the cold, concrete quiet of his garage. They were real here in a different way. They were permanent here. On the wall beside the document case was a large photograph, a print Caleb hadn't seen before. It was an image he recognized from a smaller version he'd found during his research. Claire Whitmore at the controls of an aircraft. The image slightly blurred the way photographs from that era sometimes were, but her face clear and focused, looking forward. Alert and present in the particular way of a person doing exactly what they are supposed to be doing. Below the photograph was a caption, "Claire Whitmore Sterling Test Pilot, the woman who flew the Phoenix X1. Not a woman, not one of the pilots. The woman. The definite article doing what it was supposed to do." Caleb stood in front of that photograph for a long time. I thought about what Dennis Rayburn had told him in that first phone call she tried to get anyone in aviation to pay attention, and eventually she just stopped. He thought about what Adrian had told him she carried it. He thought about a woman who had done something extraordinary and spent the rest of her life knowing she had done it and being unable to show anyone the proof. I thought about what it costs a person to be right and unbelieved, what it does to the inside of a life to carry that. He thought about all the people who carry that, not just in aviation, in every room, in every field, in every industry where the people who actually understand things are not the people in the positions that come with the authority to be believed. She deserved to be in this room while she was alive, he said. Yes, Adrian said beside him. She did. I'm sorry she's not. I am too. Adrian looked at the photograph. But she exists here now, permanently. That's not nothing. No, Caleb said. It's not. The ceremony was shorter than Caleb expected and better for it. Adrian spoke for 12 minutes. He didn't perform grief or perform triumph. He told the truth about his mother, about Samuel Whitaker, about what the program had been and what had been done to it, and what a mechanic in Tennessee had found when he looked at something everyone else had already decided was worthless. He was specific and clear, and he kept coming back to the word real, the way you come back to a word when it's the only one that fits. Dr. Miriam Tate spoke for 8 minutes about the engineering. She was precise and passionate in equal measure, which was exactly her, and she managed to make the technical detail accessible without dumbing it down, which is the rarest skill in explaining complicated things to general audiences. Victoria Collins spoke last, and she spoke for 6 minutes. She had not asked Caleb in advance what she planned to say, and when she stepped to the front of the room, he didn't know what was coming. He stood near the back with Lily beside him and watched. She talked about her company, about her family's history in aviation. She talked about the aircraft that had sat in her company's inventory for 11 years, for 38 years total, if you counted the time before her tenure, and about what it meant that nobody in her organization had looked closely enough to know what they were holding. She said it plainly, not as a corporate admission of liability or a legal statement carefully worded by counsel, as a plain acknowledgement from a person standing in front of other people. We held something significant, she said, and we did not see it. And the reason we did not see it was not that it was hidden too well. The reason is that we were not looking. We were managing assets, not understanding them. We were optimizing inventory, not honoring what the inventory represented. She paused. A man named Caleb Morgan paid $222 at a public auction for something my company was about to dispose of as scrap. He paid $222 because he was paying attention, because he had spent his life learning to look at things that other people had already decided weren't worth looking at. Another pause. I've thought a lot about what that means, about the difference between the two of us in that auction hall. I had more resources, more information, more professional infrastructure, and I saw nothing. He had a work jacket and a lifetime of experience and $222, and he saw everything. The room was very quiet. The lesson is not about money or status, she said. The lesson is about attention, about what happens when the people with authority stop paying attention, and what gets lost when they do, and what it takes to recover what was lost. She looked out at the room. I'm grateful to Mr. Morgan for what he found, and I am genuinely sorry for what my company failed to see. Both things are true at once. She stepped back. The room applauded, and Caleb stood at the back of it and felt Lily reach for his hand, the way she had in the driveway when the transport vehicle drove away with the Phoenix X1, not dramatically, just the way you reach for something that is there. He held her hand. After the ceremony, when the crowd had shifted from the formal arrangement to the more fluid movement of people exploring the museum, Karen Loy found him near the document gallery. She was smaller than he'd expected from the phone calls, compact and quick-moving, with the alert eyes of a person who processes information faster than they let on. She had a notebook, but it was closed. She wasn't working right now. She was here as someone who had spent 3 years on this story and wanted to stand inside the room it had become. "How does it feel?" she asked. It was the same question Lily had asked him that morning, and he gave her the same honest answer. Strange, good strange. You know what strikes me, she said, looking around at the room, is how simple it actually was. Not easy, I don't mean easy, but simple. You looked, everyone else didn't. That's it. That's the whole mechanism of how something like this gets buried and how it gets found. People decide something has no value before they look at it, Caleb said. Once you've decided, you stop looking, you stop paying attention, and things that need attention go a long time without it. She looked at him. I'm writing a follow-up piece about the training program you're founding. Is that still happening? We're in the process of finding a facility, he said. Adrian's foundation is partnering. Patricia is handling the legal structure. We're aiming to have the first cohort in 6 months. What are you calling it? He had thought about this. He had thought about naming it after Whitaker, or after Claire, or after Earl Pemberton, who had given him the thing he needed most when he was 19 years old and didn't yet know what he needed. The Morgan Pemberton program, he said. Earl Pemberton was my mentor. He died 6 years ago. He taught me to listen to machines. He taught me that everything has a story, and the job is to learn how to read it. He paused. I want the people who come through the program to learn that. Before they learn anything technical, that's the foundation. Karen wrote that down. He would have hated having his name on something, she said. Yeah, Caleb said. That's partly why I'm doing it. She smiled. "Can I quote you on that?" "You can quote me on that," he said. He found Lily near the end of the afternoon standing in front of the large photograph of Claire Whitmore in the document gallery. She'd been moving through the museum on her own for the past hour, which he'd permitted, because Lily's version of exploring a museum was thorough and independent and didn't benefit from a parent walking alongside. She was reading something, a panel on the wall beside Claire's photograph that he hadn't read himself yet. He stood beside her and read it. It was a short narrative about Claire's career, her training, her entry into test piloting, the barriers she navigated in an industry that had not in 1973 arranged itself to welcome her. It described the November 1973 flight in factual, careful language. It described what happened after the program's termination, the suppression of the records, the years of Claire's attempts to document what she had done, the eventual silence. And then it described what had been found and who had found it and what the finding meant. At the bottom of the panel, in slightly larger text, was a line attributed to Samuel Whitaker's final document, "I hope they understand what it means." Lily read it. Then she looked at her father. "Do you," she asked, "do I understand what it means?" He looked at the photograph of Claire Whitmore at the controls of the Phoenix X-1, at her face focused and forward-looking, doing exactly what she was supposed to be doing on a November morning 50 years ago. I thought about his $220, about his yellow legal pads, about 11 pages behind an access panel, about Richard Hale's careful, threatening voice, about Adrian Sterling with his hand flat on the fuselage of his mother's aircraft, about Victoria Collins standing in front of the bill of sale and asking him what he needed and then actually doing it, about Howard Costas holding his hand with both of his and saying 50 years, about Earl Pemberton in a hangar in Tennessee saying a machine tells its story, you just have to know how to listen. I thought about all the things people walk past, all the value that sits in corners unexamined because someone with authority has already decided what it is. All the stories that wait patient in the way, real things are patient for someone willing to get close enough to read them. I thought about a woman who had flown something extraordinary and never been believed, and a man who had encoded the truth in metal and paper and trusted it to survive, and a helicopter that had waited in the dark for 50 years for someone to look. "Yes," he said. "I think I do." Lily looked at the photograph for another moment. "She looks like she's going somewhere important," Lily said. Caleb said. "She just didn't know she was going to be the only one who knew it for a very long time." Lily turned that over for a moment. Then, "Is that why you do what you do? Work on things other people give up on?" He looked at his daughter, this 10-year-old, with her mother's eyes and her mother's precision and her own particular brand of courage that showed up not in dramatic gestures, but in the small, steady way she walked through things that were hard. "I do it," he said, "because someone taught me to pay attention. And once you know how to pay attention, you see things. And once you see things, you can't unsee them." He paused. "The helicopter was there the whole time. I just looked." She nodded. "I want to learn," she said. "What Earl taught you, how to listen to machines." He looked at her. "You already know how," he said. "You've been watching me do it since before you could talk." She thought about that. "Will you teach me for real in the garage?" "Yes," he said. "Starting tomorrow if you want." "I want," she said. She reached over and took his hand again, and they stood together in front of Claire Whitmore's photograph in the quiet of the document gallery, the rest of the museum moving and talking around them, the afternoon light coming through the high windows at the angle it reaches in late October, long and golden and a little thin, the way October light is like it's being careful with itself. The drive home was quieter than the drive there. Not because the day had been heavy, it had been in some ways, but not the kind of heavy that weighs you down, the kind of heavy that settles you, the kind that comes from something being completed that needed to be completed. Lily fell asleep 20 minutes from home, the way she sometimes did on long drives with her head against the window and her jacket pulled up around her shoulders. Caleb drove and didn't turn on the radio. He thought about the shop waiting for him, about the Patterson turbine inspection that he'd finished just under the deadline, about the 3 jobs coming in next week that he'd need to plan his days around, about the training program and the months of work ahead to build it from a conversation and a handshake into something real that would outlast him. He thought about the framed $222 bill of sale on his workshop wall, about the strip of white tape beneath it with Whitaker's words in black marker. I thought about tomorrow morning, a Saturday, which meant Lily had no school and would want to start her education in the garage, and he'd need to figure out what to start with. What the first thing was that Earl would have started with the first lesson that had made him understand that machines were not objects to be operated, but stories to be read. He thought Earl would have started with listening, just standing next to something and being quiet, and letting it tell you what it needed you to know. That was the beginning of everything. He pulled into the driveway and turned off the engine and sat for a moment in the quiet of the truck. The shop light was on. He'd left it on when they left that morning, which he always did, a habit from the years when he'd been coming and going at odd hours and hadn't wanted to fumble with a key in the dark. The light came through the side window of the garage and lay across the gravel in a pale rectangle. The garage was empty now. The Phoenix X1 was in Nashville behind glass, permanent scene, but the garage would not be empty for long, because there was always another machine. There was always another thing that someone had decided was not worth looking at. There was always something waiting in a corner somewhere with a story encoded in its structure, patient, in the way real things are patient, waiting for someone to get close enough to listen. Caleb Morgan sat in his truck in his driveway and understood clearly and completely that he would spend the rest of his working life being that person. Not because he was remarkable, not because the story had made him something he hadn't been before, but because he always had been. Because Earl Pemberton had handed him the ability to see when he was 19 years old in a hangar in Tennessee, and he had used it every day since, and one day he had walked into an auction hall and used it there, and the thing he had always known how to do had found its largest consequence. He reached over and gently shook Lily's shoulder. "We're home," he said. She blinked awake, oriented herself, unbuckled her seatbelt. "Did you have a good day?" she asked, still half asleep. He thought about Howard Costas, reading Claire Whitmore's name on a placard and standing there with his son's hand on his shoulder. About Adrian Sterling with his hand flat on his mother's aircraft, saying she flew you. About Victoria Collins saying I am genuinely sorry to a room full of people and meaning it. About Karen Loy with her closed notebook standing in the room that her 3 years of attention had helped build. About a woman named Claire who flew something extraordinary and waited 50 years to be believed. About a man named Samuel who encoded the truth in metal and paper and trusted it to survive. About a mechanic who paid $220 and looked. "Yeah," he said, "I had a good day." They went inside and the shop light stayed on, and somewhere in Nashville, a helicopter that had waited 50 years in the dark was finally permanently, irrevocably seen, and the truth which had never disappeared had simply stopped waiting.